Treason. While we were chattering about the mundanity of human relationships, our retired teacher folded the newspaper he'd been reading, left it on the table, and rose from his seat to approach us. We all turned into cats who'd spilled milk. He looked at us mischievously, then demanded an explanation. "Why are you silent? Speak up." We glanced at each other out of the corner of our eyes, as if we were naughty children who had shared a crime. After a moment of glance, one of us spoke up. "Teacher, we can't understand how people exploit your good intentions." "Me? No, teacher, not you, everyone." After a short pause, he asked him to continue. "So, what? When we try to shop from familiar shopkeepers, they don't give us their goods at a lower price." "Of course not. Business is one thing, friendship is another. Snow is falling on the mountains you trust. And you're cold." We sit down, drink their tea, and have long conversations. When it comes to money, God created brothers as brothers, but He created their purses separately. "Teacher, you're not taking our side, but you have no room to be taken. The best thing is, let me tell you about a few Don Quixotes from our political history. Maybe then you'll stop making this issue a problem." We reluctantly accepted that we were in a difficult situation. It was clear that he was enjoying himself, even though he tried not to show it. The first of these is one of the rare, colorful figures in the country's political life. While the anecdotes about him reflect his witty personality, his seemingly exaggerated experiences reveal him to be the epitome of the chronic opposition. He was a perpetual oppositionist, opposed to everything, everyone, even himself. Even when he became a partner in power, he never abandoned his oppositional stance. He was the voice of the people. They called him the Storm of the Steppe. He possessed a powerful oratorical voice. He extended his 5.5 hours of uninterrupted speech on the parliamentary podium to 8.5 hours before the people. The government's efforts to silence him began even in Parliament, and the regulation restricting MPs' speaking time curtailed this impertinent figure. At one rally, he observed the crowd for minutes, saying, "The government has banned speech, so let's have a good time before we ban looks." He was always a relentless follower of those in power. One government saw no harm in resorting to punishing him and his voters through completely inappropriate methods. The administration went so far in this regard that it achieved an event worthy of exemplary political history. It transformed the province that had sent this extraordinary politician to parliament into a district in an extraordinary act. After many years of a single-party era, while people were hoping for a transition to democracy, they argued with the foresight of a decade that nothing had changed. However, it was quite interesting that he considered the military coup a legitimate coup, despite his democratic preferences. Our leader, who spent hours reading parliamentary minutes, documents, papers, and newspaper clippings from the bag he always carried with him at rallies, and who explained political events and government policies to the public with jokes and popular analogies, admittedly contributed significantly to the acceptance of politics in the country and the formation of policies that favored the people. However, because his observations were not based on a political program and thought, the opposition line failed to become institutionalized and lasted after the transition to multi-party rule. He was in opposition for the sake of being in opposition. He was in opposition just for the sake of being in opposition. With his charisma stemming from a dry, unyielding stubbornness, he listened to no one. He thought big and made big mistakes. He was in politics not to gain power, but to remain in opposition, and no one was sure whether he was aware of this. The public's favor was limited to the rally squares, and, incomprehensibly, wasn't reflected at the ballot box. He was aware of this, and he expressed it with his humorous style. However, he eventually came to hate politics, which he equated with the spirit of evil, saying, "I fell in love with Layla, who thought she had no eye marks on her face, and she was called politics. I later realized that she had been married to 40,000 people before me." The funeral ceremony caused a huge crowd, attended by a huge crowd. Despite having left active politics 30 years ago, it was clear that she still commanded great affection among the people. However, in his internal examination, as he juxtaposed disappointment and betrayal, I believe there was little room left for the latter. His life was not a manifestation of betrayal, but of profound disappointment. His flawed decisions were inevitably blamed on flawed judgment regarding matters he overestimated. No one could blame others for this. Even when he resigned from the party he founded, he fell victim not to betrayal, but to disappointment. Our old friend concluded his remarks about his hero with a brief and meaningful assessment. Years later, another party leader who moved in the same political direction and experienced the same emotions took her place on the political scene. However, just 6 or 7 years later, this party leader, who died in a suspicious helicopter crash, visited him in the hospital before his death. He said the following to him: "My young friend, I want to forget and be forgotten. You run away, you lose yourself, you work, and in the end, you are left with your bladder." After saying these words, our old friend paused briefly. And then, while we were still reeling from his final words, he moved on to his second hero. His talents, intellectual knowledge, accumulated experience, and charismatic personality, along with the influence of internal and external dynamics, propelled our new man to leadership on his political path. He forged a bond with his citizens that would endure even years after his death. His name was written in stone. However, he could not become a transformational leader. Why? His intellectual side, his passion for art, and his elegant style contributed to his distinctive place in the political world. The poems of the poet Prime Minister, who aimed to embody the virtues of being a timeless, ever-preserving human being, were overshadowed by his rally speeches. However, he also earned the title of the most assassinated leader in the country's political history. It is argued that these heinous attempts against him are a reflection of the deep conflicts and complex dynamics in the country's political past. While large-scale reforms, such as efforts to transform the economic and social structure in rural areas, were not the direct cause of the assassination attempts, they had the potential to create indirect effects, and this must have been perceived as a threat by groups seeking to maintain the status quo. However, his attempts to pursue an independent and upright foreign policy must have angered and mobilized those who would have tried to stop him. He was seen as an honest, moral, gentle, and humble leader, far from ostentation, and was described as one of the most knowledgeable and polite leaders in politics. He possessed the identity of a dove, hovering in the air with the sound of his wings on issues of democracy and freedom. Karaoglan, who integrated with the people with the importance he placed on peasants, workers, and laborers, was a source of hope. People were naming their children after him. However, he engaged in a Machiavellian act that is considered a dark stain in the history of the country's politics. He bought 10 opposition deputies and gave them ministerial positions in the government he formed. This political move greatly angered the opposing party leader, who for a long time referred to him as head of the government instead of prime minister, meaning irregular, gang leader, or so-called leader. Criticism centered on whether such a bargaining was ethically and politically correct. While this incident demonstrated his pragmatic leadership in his political career, it also highlighted his sensitivities regarding political ethics. While it damaged Karaoglan's credibility in the public eye, it also demonstrated his talent for political strategy and his determination to form a government. Despite everything, the fact that he is remembered as a leader overshadowed by this event seems inevitably a twist of fate. Many years later, in an interview with him, he openly admitted that this action, known as the 11 Incident, was the, quote, biggest mistake of his political life. This politician's national policy initiatives, which pursue national interests, somehow evoke the famous knight attacking windmills with his lance. Yet his life was a poem, and it began with these words: "If, when everyone around you is panicking and they know the reason is you." Finally, when he was abandoned, one by one, two by two, and all together by his companions, whom he had walked alongside for years, I doubt he could find refuge from the unreliable, insidious, and hazy world of politics to the bright and hopeful world of art. There was silence for a while. In his eyes, the people accepted their hero, with all his merits and sins, and he moved on to the third person. Probably, when Karaoglan was mobilizing people in society, he lacked a strong historical base from the past. He was an ideological voice, calling on them to take the reins of their destiny, an example of which had never been seen before, except during the War of Independence. The magnitude of his success stemmed partly from this. However, our third hero was a representative of an older, ideological and religious thought that existed in these lands. He had a strong base, stretching back centuries. His supporters, and even those who were not, gave him the most appropriate nickname, Mujahid. One of us could not restrain himself and issued a warning. "Teacher, we are having trouble following you." As always, he remained deaf. His political views were shaped by an ideology built on religious values. The struggle for religion to come to power was tantamount to the individual's debt of servitude to God. This ideology has always been a bureaucratic. He aimed to expand the sphere of influence of the rebel-controlled religion, ensuring it played a more active role in the country's social, economic, and political life, and placed fundamental principles such as justice, solidarity, and morality at the center of his policies. However, his ideology, which focused on the ability to distinguish right from wrong, was unacceptable according to the system that defined the boundaries of religion, It was as if he was being met with this very pretext. The accusations centered on the records of unaccountable party expenditures, and this accusation has always remained with him, like an indelible trace of mud. But he did not withdraw into himself. He once again demonstrated his ideological commitment and determination. Although isolated during this process, he never compromised his own stance and remained the leader of the movement. He argued against his former students who had left the party and founded a new political party that they had strayed from their ideological line and were under the influence of external forces. He viewed this separation as a betrayal and criticized them for weakening the party's core values. 2 years after his sentence was commuted by the president, who had once been his student, he was re-elected as chairman of his party. However, he passed away just 2 months later, at the age of 85. His legacy had been plundered by his students while he was still alive. After his death, the final act of this conflict was played out between his children. It is hoped that this disappointment they experienced in the final stages of their lives must have been a unique experience, crowning the continuing development of their rich personalities. However, it seems that even though the storm of the steppe distanced them, the political charm and allure of Karaoglan and Mukahit remained with them until the very end of their life stories. Walking history fell silent, as if it had run out of things to say. But we knew it was full. He always had something to say. We all unhesitatingly accepted that he was a keen researcher and observer. But the silence stretched on. 2 of us left the table late in the night, silent on their faces, with the silence of a ghost. But the others had no intention of leaving. The first speaker, as if to lighten the mood and with humor, said, "We can listen to another sad story." Our old friend replied, as if awakened from a slumber, "Ha!" Then, as if starting mid-sentence, he added, "Since the 80s, when we were channeled, under the name of freedom, it's become like a festival held in honor of the Spanish guardian angel, with bulls unleashed, like a Mother's Day." Of course, Judas's kisses were flying in the air. But more. "Et tu brute?" Our witty friend interjected, "Teacher, could you simplify it?" During those poplar-like student years, we used to look for ways to take the exams of the professors whose classes we didn't attend. They would sign our attendance records and check our eligibility from there. The instructor looked at my notebook, which lacked the necessary signatures, and after a brief moment of breathless hesitation, he signed it. If I recall correctly, I received a passing grade on the exam. He was an associate professor at the time, promising a future for the country not only in his field, but also in other fields, with his intellectual expertise. Just a few years after becoming a professor, he became rector of a university. However, a year later, in his new position, he died of a heart attack at what could be considered the spring of his maturity. He was undoubtedly a loss to the nation's culture. He had packed a great deal into his short life. In addition to scientific studies in his field, he was also interested in current events. Among the books he wrote, driven by his wide range of interests, were those on social problems rooted in the country's long history. He was also the editor-in-chief of a newspaper. At this point, he took a short breath. His eyes looked back 50 years. As I recall, he had a sincere and outspoken personality, with a quiet and calm demeanor. However, he was not emotional, but rather focused on logic and analysis. He possessed a disciplined, hardworking, and intellectual nature. As one might expect, he was a scholar who questioned and deeply examined events. One day, he wrote a necrological article in the newspaper. I better understood the significance of this piece, which he wrote in memory of his deceased professor, thanks to an assignment given by another teacher. The text he asked me to transcribe was the deceased scientist's bibliography. It was such a long list that it brought to mind an anecdotal story. Legend has it that when a great philosopher or scientist passes away, their works are loaded on one side of a camel and their coffin on the other. This is how a balance is achieved. An anecdote about his teacher provides an important clue to the late man's rich personality. He seemingly single-handedly filled the intellectual life, which was extremely barren during the establishment of the new regime in the country. He broke many new ground with his works in philosophy, sociology, social anthropology, aesthetics, logic, history, fiction, and even poetry. One day, when asked why he was so distracted, he reportedly replied, "I have to personally prepare the sources for the work I'm going to write." Referring to my teacher's newspaper article, he worked with superhuman effort, without wasting a single moment. He was someone who disregarded and ignored not only mental, but even physical fatigue. His former students would tell of some of his work while commuting to the faculty by tram. Although he was someone who never fit in and constantly renewed himself, his sensitivity and irritability, along with the mindset of the difficult times in the society he lived in, pushed him into the shadows. His death effectively marked the end of an era in the philosophy of science in the country. Essentially, everything up to this point had been normal. Now, let's talk about another hero of ours, the famous and highly influential writer of our recent history, N.F. With his harsh and sharp style, he thoroughly deserved the title of pencil writer. However, everyone will agree that his style was mild when compared to C.M.'s. Because in C.M.'s writings, the mastery of language was complemented by the richness of the content. N.F. appealed to the emotions, while our hero appealed to both emotions and reason. However, as fate would have it, the pen writer's influence on our recent political history was incomparably superior. I had never met C.M. in my life. I knew only from newspaper articles, books, and stories about him. It was as if he had stepped out of a Far Eastern legend and landed right in the middle of the country. His admirers would probably have nominated him for World Cultural Heritage if it had been possible. It must have been a stroke of luck that he came across my teacher's article and wrote something truly unwritable himself. "We owe respect to the living and truth to the dead," he declared, reminiscent of Kiraman Katibin. He went on and on. He made the deceased a deceased. And frankly, no one dared to approach this polemic. N.F. also tried the dead, who couldn't defend themselves, in an imaginary court in which he was the prosecutor. But, if I remember correctly, C.M.'s truth remained unanswered. What does this mean now? Our old friend smiled strangely. We couldn't comprehend how meaningful and influential a polemic from half a century ago could have been. But he, on the other hand, was a rather complicated matter for us. This made the problem even more inextricably complicated. About 100 years ago, someone developed a concept using the word treason, specifically for the intellectual segment. In his work, the author criticized intellectuals' abandonment of their quest for universal morality and truth, surrendering to political ideologies or pragmatism. According to him, the fundamental duty of intellectuals was to defend universal values such as justice, truth, and reason, independent of time and place. However, he observed that the intellectuals of his time, for various reasons, deviated from these ideals and entered the service of political and national interests. 50 years later, this concept came to life in our country through accusations between members of different political views. The concept generally referred to the situation where those considered intellectuals used their knowledge, talents, and social influence in a manner contrary to universal values, ethical principles, or the ideals they defended. This expression was used to criticize intellectuals who remained indifferent to social problems, aligned themselves with those in power, or compromised their principles for their own interests. Remember the saying attributed to the Prophet: "The worst scholars are those who visit emirs. The best emirs are those who visit scholars." Nationalist and conservative segments viewed left-leaning intellectuals as disconnected from the people, admirers of the West, or representatives of foreign ideologies. According to these segments, intellectuals were committing, quote, betrayal by disdaining or completely ignoring the country's culture, traditions, and religious values. On the left, this term was more commonly used for intellectuals who compromised with the system or distanced themselves from revolutionary ideals. In other words, intellectuals who supported the status quo or served the bourgeoisie instead of defending the interests of the people were criticized. The silence of intellectuals or their avoidance of responsibility in social crises was also seen as a form of betrayal. Alienation, blindly embracing Western-centric ideas or rejecting local culture, were criticized, especially in conservative segments, as imitation of the West. These criticisms were not only criticized, but also demonized. I think my professor, by sometimes remaining silent and not responding, didn't stand behind his condolences. Is it the duty of his students, 50 years later, to defend the demonized? But the criticism was also connected to an ad hominem in this respect. A fake cough was heard from our humorous friend. He obviously seemed to be asking for an explanation. But this time, our old friend explained. In other words, he hit below the belt with his criticism. His attitudes and principles were criticized with criticism. Along with this, there was a heavy attack on his personality. "We owe him the truth," he declared, considering it his supreme duty to reveal what a traitor he was. Instead of this library rat taking to the streets and declaring, his silence was proving that he supported the status quo, that is, the policies of the government. He was a wretched Western imitator who had alienated himself from his own culture by focusing on abstract theories instead of understanding the problems of the peasantry or working class. And instead of being the conscience of his time, he chose to betray thought by sheltering in the so-called nobility of thought in his ivory tower. Yet the victim, in its simplest form, rejected from the outset the use of thought for instrumental purposes, such as serving a particular ideology, securing a personal advantage, or manipulating others. He went beyond seeing thought as a tool, a step, or a method, and accepted that thought had a value in itself. He targeted the act of thinking for its intrinsic value, explaining things as they are, not as they should be, rather than as they should be. However, there was a disturbing aspect. I sensed an incredible audacity in this polemic. The crime, accused of insulting the victim's personality, was being committed as if it were being criticized. The deceased was betraying himself by abandoning the universal morality and search for truth expected of him during his lifetime, and failing to act in accordance with political ideology. It was as if, through a dishonest game of reasoning, he was a traitor for not betraying. Furthermore, in the same article, the author also acted as a mentor to my professor, acting as a kind of elder brother, a guide for how he should act. This approach was nothing more than a more direct and blatantly rude expression of the "if I were you" rhetoric, a phrase I have never forgiven in my life. He fell silent, but he hadn't finished the story, nor had he yet spoken his final words. We were looking into his mouth. Today, streets, cultural centers, libraries, schools, and awards are named after CM and NF in various cities across the country. In recognition of CM's contributions to the intellectual world, several educational institutions and research centers also bear his name. However, there is no clear precedent for deceased or deceased in concrete areas. Our old friend smiled bitterly. Betrayal has never been so cheap. Unfortunately, in that final blow, when you can no longer retaliate, you realize who the traitor is. You can accept disappointment in some way. However, accepting betrayal isn't easy, not easy at all.